Well, it's that time again. As I type this up, we're coming close to the finish of the Sega Mega Wheel. Over 850 games have been played. I can confidently say that I have played every baseball game on the system, and that there's far too many of them, that there's a whole sea of middling platformers out there you probably don't know about, as well as some good-looking Japanese titles that are still yet to be translated, and shockingly Green Dog hasn't come up yet, much to everybody's distress. And of course, playing all of these games has led me to discoveries both brilliant and shocking. I've already done one video for these deep-cut Mega Drive games that few have heard of, yet alone played, and it's time for another. Once again, there's 10 titles here. 5 of them are most certainly worth looking at, while the other 5, well, they can get pretty ugly, to the point where even the most commonly accepted terrible titles from the system look pretty good in comparison. So let's get on with it. I'm going to kick things off with everyone's favourite Sega add-on, the Mega Modem. Yes, it's Sega MegaNet time once again. I did feature AWOG Hero in the Sky in the last video, which I actually thought was quite decent and deserved a bit of love. But today I've got what might just be the best original game on the whole Shokan. It's a game you may possibly be aware of, but not one that ever seems to have the best reputation. For my money, it's a title that's frightfully misunderstood. It certainly was at the time when seemingly every review that I can remember lined up to give it a good kick-in. I am, of course, talking about Fatal Labyrinth from 1990, which in Japan had the much better title of Labyrinth of Death. Fatal Labyrinth is one of only a handful of MegaNet games to get a cartridge release outside of Japan. The other main one was Flicky, and if you want to be picky, Columns was on there as well, although that had already come out on cart worldwide before appearing on the Shokan, or Game Library. It is the closest thing that the MegaNet has to a full-on RPG, or at least as much as you can possibly fit into a ROM that is all of 128 kilobytes in size. MegaNet games had to be that small, seeing as they had to be downloaded by the user anytime they wanted to play, and for comparison's sake you could fit 4 128 kilobyte Fatal Labyrinth ROMs into one 512 kilobyte Altered Beast ROM, one of the first cartridges released for the system. As you might expect, there's not a whole lot of story in a game this size. You play as a hero named Tricar, and you must enter the Castle of Doom, fight your way through 30 floors, and retrieve the Holy Goblet. Simple enough, but different to anything else on the system. Why? Well, because this is the Mega Drive's only roguelike title. Anytime you play, the levels, monsters, items and all of that will be randomly selected. And if you should fall in combat, well, that's your lot. Sort of, anyway. The Western cartridge does give you the option to continue on the floor you lost on, but the original Japanese version does not, so that's what you should go to for the full-on roguelike experience. As with a lot of roguelikes, the amount of gold you pick up along the way does little except determine how nice your grave ends up looking. The game has most of what you would expect from a roguelike: gradually better weapons and armour as you go, movement that is a bit more like a turn-based game rather than being totally fluid, a whole bunch of enemies that will greatly increase in level and challenge, the need to pick up everything that's lying around and considering whether you really ought to get into a fight or not, potions, rings and scrolls that could have good or bad effects, as well as the odd cursed weapon, the need to eat food that happens to be lying on these surely dirty floors but not too much so that you end up slowing yourself down, the need to find secret doors on occasion. It's got all that you need, really. It can be a fiendish game. It's the sort where you think that you're doing fine and breezing along, only for one battle or one bad item to completely turn everything on its head and leave you scraping for survival until you get to the point where you're desperately trying to run from all enemies, knowing you're essentially doomed but thinking that maybe, just maybe, you can turn it around until the inevitable finally happens. And it's certainly got the quality of wanting to have another go after that to see if you can get further and crack this unholy tower. As I recall, the reviews for Fatal Labyrinth at the time were largely quite savage. It was rejected as a miserable attempt at an RPG with very basic graphics and repetitive music, treated as a poor man's Gauntlet even though the games are rather different. It was also largely condemned as being too easy. Adding continues in the Western version is a bit unfortunate, seeing as it does allow you to brute force the title somewhat, and I would definitely recommend playing the original Labyrinth of Death instead, so that you'll actually have a properly tough challenge. For me though, this game is absolutely superb. There is nothing else like it on the Mega Drive, and when you consider it is actually a 128KB MegaNet title, they fit a hell of a lot in here. It puts almost every other MegaNet game to shame with the exception of Flicky and possibly Penguin Land. As an aside, you may also want to consider Dragon Crystal, a 1991 Master System and Game Gear roguelike that is something of a successor to this one. I expected very little from Fatal Labyrinth when I booted it up, based on what I thought I knew about it, but this game's been one of the most welcome surprises in the whole of my Mega Wheel journey. Go play it. Naturally, a bad game must follow a good one, and it makes sense to go for another Sega MegaNet title. Now, I'm quite spoiled for choice when it comes to bad MegaNet games, but I've gone for the one with a rather famous character, Sonic Eraser from 1991. Certainly one of the most obscure games in the whole Sonic the Hedgehog franchise, this wasn't dumped anywhere until 2004 when it appeared on a website named Sonic Cult. Unsurprisingly perhaps, it's the only Mega Drive Sonic game that's never appeared on any compilation release. Seeing as it's little more than a ludicrously simple puzzle game, it's not hard to see why. Sonic Eraser is basically a simplified version of Columns. You pick a level of difficulty and you remove pieces by matching 2 of them rather than 3. If you're in the Versus mode, a combination of more than 3 matches triggers a little cutscene where your Sonic beats up on the other one and they lose control of their pieces momentarily. And yeah, that's it aside from a couple of other modes like a regular marathon, flash mode a la Columns, and some other little bits. Sonic appears even less in these ones, only occasionally dropping in to spin about and clear a few pieces. The game itself feels especially redundant seeing as there is already a version of the proper Columns on the Toshokan, but while the gameplay isn't necessarily bad enough to warrant a mention, the music certainly is. I mean, just listen to this theme here. Now, people tend to bag a lot on Sonic Spinball's options menu theme, but Sonic Eraser makes it sound like bloody Streets of Rage in comparison. This more than anything else makes Sonic Eraser quite the unpleasant experience, and it means that, well, even if you're a big fan of the Blue Bullet, you probably still shouldn't really bother trying to seek this one out. Go and play Columns, go and play Mean Bean Machine if you're desperately needing some Sonic in your puzzling, just go and do anything else. Up next, we're doing something a bit different. We've got 2 compilation cartridges featuring classic games from the arcade golden age. Neither of these really get mentioned at all, seeing as they're old ports of even older games on an older system, both of which were released pretty late into the life of the system, but they're both worthy of attention, albeit for entirely different reasons. First up, we have Williams Arcade's Greatest Hits. This came out in '96 and was released as Midway Presents Arcade's Greatest Hits in Europe. We have 5 classic Williams titles here: Defender, Defender 2, or rather Stargate as it's also known, Joust, Robotron 2084, and Sinistar. This compilation also came out on 32-bit machines and even the Dreamcast, although this 16-bit version is only missing out on one game. The version on the PlayStation, Saturn and what have you also included Bubbles. I think this needs highlighting mainly due to the incredibly high quality of the ports. I mean, look at them. Digital Eclipse handled them, and they're damn well perfect. And this is on the Mega Drive, at a time when MAME wasn't even born yet. It would be easy to release some half-assed guff that makes a mockery of these legendary titles, but this is most certainly not that. This is fantastically accurate. Whilst having a look around to find info about this title, I found a cool comment from George Phillips, who worked on Joust for this cart, left on a video by the almighty Nick Jenkin that explained the process here. What we have with these titles is a line-by-line translation of the original 6809 assembly code into 68000 code, something that's a wholly different kettle of fish from emulation, and the effort certainly shows. Even Robotron ends up working quite well. Not having dual sticks is obviously a blow here, but you can trigger auto-fire and cycle quickly between directions, which doesn't work too badly. There's also a 6-button mode for this game that is closer to having dual sticks, as well as an option to tilt the controller 90 degrees and play it that way. I must say I'm very impressed by this compilation. I didn't really think that you would be able to play such arcade-accurate versions of these Golden Age games, a whole bunch of which are among my very favourites, here on the Mega Drive in 1996, but here it is, and it's obviously wonderful. And naturally, here we have a compilation that's not wonderful at all. Arcade Classics is another 1996 game, and this time Atari is the subject. Already we're suffering a bit in comparison to the Williams compilation, as this only features 3 titles: Pon, Centipede, and Missile Command. That's a bit stingy, isn't it? These aren't emulations either, they're newly programmed versions of each game, although each game has 2 separate versions, a classic one and a Sega one. Although truthfully the only real difference between them is in graphics, and often the supposedly enhanced Sega version ends up looking worse than the classic one. Shockingly, Centipede is not enhanced through the addition of backgrounds that just end up interfering with the gameplay, and indeed take out the pop of these bugs and mushrooms moving around on black that made the original arcade entice so many folks back in the day. Still, if I had to specifically complain about one of these 3 titles, well, naturally it's going to be Missile Command. This is one of my favourite games full stop, let alone Golden Age arcades. It's Dave Tora's monumental, apocalyptic classic, and this compilation ruins it completely. For some reason it decides to get rid of a fundamental part of the game. You do not have 3 missile batteries, and instead there's only 1. Now this is how the original 1981 port of the arcade played on the Atari 2600. There it's totally understandable seeing as you've only got a 1-button joystick and all is completely fine. It's a great port. But I fail to understand why you would do that here when 3 buttons are right bloody there laid out on a controller that's pretty well suited to the game, button-wise at least. It's also appallingly slow as well. Naturally the controls can't move as fast as the original seeing as there's no trackball, but still this is just quite the dreadful treatment of such a great game. Oh yeah, and Pon is also here, or Ultra Pon as it's known. Nothing much wrong with this. It's Pon, complete with all the different modes you'd find on a binatone machine that's been up in your loft for 30 years. Nothing more and nothing less. But Centipede and Missile Command? Yeah, no thanks. The Mega Drive was capable of a lot more than this complete rubbish. Up next we have Trampoline Terror. This is a puzzle game from 1990 by NCS, released in North America by the somewhat short-lived DreamWorks that's nothing at all to do with Steven Spielberg. Oddly enough, despite being made by a Japanese studio, Trampoline Terror only ever came out in the States and Canada. You get 33 levels and your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to defuse the bombs on the grid by walking over them, usually getting there by jumping on trampolines that'll break if you use them too much, but do allow you to clear the odd gap. Naturally there's enemies to deal with too, and you can either avoid them or use powerballs to knock them out. These can be picked up on most of the stages. The play here may remind you a little bit of Amiga games like Bombuzal or indeed Jumpin' Jackson. As you may be able to deduce from how I structure these videos, I quite enjoy Trampoline Terror. It's a simple, cutesy little puzzler, not necessarily the sort of game that's going to be an essential all-timer, but something that you can happily put on for a little while and zone out to. Evading the various monsters, curling your way around them with your jumps, and perhaps hitting them with one of those powerballs as you bounce along is quite enjoyable. Games like this are, well, they may not be the best, but sometimes they're just, necessary. But this does spark another little nostalgic tangent in me, mind you. It makes me think of an old document on the internet, a big old .txt tome called the G3 or the Genesis Game Guide by Sam Pettis, something that you can still find on websites like GameFAQs and was originally available on the legendary Eidolon Zine in around about 1999. This is what you would consult back in the day to find info on every Mega Drive game ever released, and even if it's a bit inaccurate these days, it is truly a humongous effort. Anywho, the entry for Trampoline Terror always stuck in my mind. The author of this guide absolutely hated it. He says that it's stupid, 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 and goes as far as to say that it's the absolute worst Genesis game ever made. Now, I always kind of shied away from Trampoline Terror for this reason, I must say, even after playing some quite god-awful games indeed. So to ultimately find out that the actual Trampoline Terror, after all these years, is a perfectly inoffensive and actually quite casually entertaining game is, well, it's somewhat amusing. And here's another cutesy game, but one that's much more of a nightmare. Back years ago when I looked at the work of Tectoy and Sega in Brazil, I think I only had the briefest of looks at Ferias Frustradas do Pica-Pau, a game from 1996. But it's time for a more detailed go at it because, well, Frustradas is most assuredly right. This game is in fact so frustradas that playing it for any length of time is seriously not recommended. It's the sort of thing that will make you want to drain a few tears into your beer, in fact. Woody Woodpecker, being one of the most popular cartoon characters of them all in Brazil, is the sort of official game you would expect Tectoy to make. But yeah, this one is nasty. The game's title translates to Woody Woodpecker's Frustrated Adventures, and it sees our hero go to various locales trying to recover members of his family in a plot that's, well, generic enough. It's the sort of thing that could easily have been a functional, if middling, licensed platformer, but sadly it's something where Tectoy perhaps not having so much experience in the world of game design shows. The looks and animation are fine, but the collision detection is all over the shop. Woody's attack is damn near useless most of the time. You try and try, but it's hard to actually hit anything with it. Getting hit yourself results in you being pinballed all over the place because there's no recovery time. I will say, mind you, that we've got a far worse example of that coming later. The jumping is a real pain, and the design, the way enemies are put down, good lord, it's nasty from the off to the point where I'm pretty sure that only dumb luck managed to take me all the way to the second level. It's almost just a case of being pinballed around at the right time, and I eventually got to a point where I just couldn't get any further. I almost don't want to be too nasty about this title, as bad as it is. It is something original, perhaps not done with a whole lot of resources, something unique for a home audience that you can be guaranteed thoroughly adored Woody Woodpecker. And sure, I have another platformer later where the real bile is going to come out, but still, this has to be one of the worst of the many cartoon-based platformers on the system, I'm afraid. We've got the sports section next, and our good game here is, well, it's not necessarily amazing, but it's something that would have really worked out great if there was just a bit more added to it. Also, it's probably a more important game than you know, at least in its original arcade form. Now, if you asked most people to name some sillier, arcadey sports games on the Mega Drive, 9 out of 10 people would probably mention NBA Jam. No surprise there, considering how huge it is. In fact, there are 4 NBA Jam titles on the Mega Drive: the original, Tournament Edition, College Slam, and NBA Hand Time, which is by the same people, but had to have the name changed after Acclaim acquired the NBA Jam franchise rights. But there is another arcadey sports game from Midway that came before all these that's worth looking at. And no, we're not talking about arch rivals. Instead, we're off to the world of Gridiron for Super High Impact, a 1992 port of a 1991 arcade released only in North America. Usually when it comes to American football on the system, there's not a whole lot of point playing anything but Madden. Most of the other serious football games are total busts. The likes of Mutant League Football and the Tecmo Super Bowl games allow for a bit more fun to be had with an arcadey NFL game, and this one should be up there with them. It's incredibly easy to pick up, features the appropriately silly play names, and lots of cool animations. It's quite fun to see a player's uniform utterly disintegrate when you tackle them. Most of what's in the arcade game is here, happily enough. What we have here, essentially, is NBA Jam meets Gridiron, albeit a year or so before that game was a thing. And it's good. It is a shame that the Mega Drive version doesn't feature Sirius by the Alan Parsons project, however, which is on the arcade. Perhaps they should have used that in an NBA Jam game at some point. Anyway, if there is one big issue with the title, it's that there's not much here. You play either against the computer, who's pretty dim, or a human, and that's it. No tournament modes to speak of, I'm afraid. So yeah, if you don't have anyone to play with, this isn't going to have much of a shelf life. But it's enjoyable, it helped pave the way for NBA Jam, not to mention all-conquering future successor NFL Blitz, and it also helped birth one of the most legendary memes in games. This is actually the arcade that Ed Boon helmed before Mortal Kombat, and fellow future MK staff member Dan Forden headed up the music and sound. It's here, while playing and testing Super High Impact against other staff members, where Dan would coin his signature phrase, "I predict Toasty!" which of course would then go on to be used throughout the Mortal Kombat series of games. So, there you go. Your code! Let's go back to NBA Jam for a bit. Obviously, the popularity of the game meant that it had a fair few imitators of much lesser quality. Usually, the standard bearer of "We have NBA Jam at home" on the Mega Drive would be Accolade's Barkley's Shut Up and Jam, a 2-on-2 street basketball game that's trying to get some of that midway magic, but naturally ends up being that little bit worse in every respect. However, I'm not talking about that game. Instead, I'm going to talk about GTE Imagitech's Jammit, a 1994 title that's much more obscure and was only released in the US, but once again is trying to ride those coattails and ultimately throws up a big fat brick. Still, it might be a contender for the most totally radical 90s dude game on the system, right up there with Skitchin, for reasons that will become clear. Jammit is one of the few examples of one-on-one basketball that you'll find on the Mega Drive, with only Jordan vs Bird and NBA All-Star Challenge out there for competition. It's not necessarily a bad idea on paper, and you've got a bunch of different modes to play around in, from plain old normal stuff to things like Hotspot or Poison. Trouble kinda brews already, however, when you see that there's only 3 characters to choose from, which for 1994 is quite a miserable selection indeed. They are a little bit different in what they can do. Roxy can spin while Chill can charge, for example, but surely there could have been a bit more variety here. Actually getting into the game is where everything falls down. I kind of think of this as Pit Fighter only basketball, mainly because of how stilted looking all the digitised animation is. While digitised graphics generally haven't aged very well, this once again feels quite basic indeed. Comparing it to something like Mortal Kombat almost feels unfair, and the poor quality of the animation makes the gameplay feel even more sluggish and cumbersome than it already is. It just doesn't have the speed of something like NBA Jam. Naturally, the game is chock full of 90s-isms. You've got tons of speech samples that are going to get repetitive very quickly. There's the option to use those endlessly to taunt your opponent when they're doing free throws, and all the mullets and ghetto blasters that you can eat. Perhaps the best feature of this excess of pandering is that Jammit did actually come with a CD packed into it, a few tracks of 90s hip-hop and alt-rock, mostly from artists probably not too well known today like Shaheem, Brother Kane, The College Boys and Gilby Clarke. Still, that's not something you'd often get. It may set off a few nostalgia twingers, and it is apparently pretty damn rare and expensive these days. Still, perhaps nothing is quite as 90s as the blurb that you'll find on the front of this promo CD. I mean, my god. Okay, here are the rules. There are none. No stats, no squeaky clean courts, high-priced players, or NBA Nerds and Babies Association rules. This is Jammit, where you play on the streets and push to the limit. Flaunt it. Man, you look too good. Forget those robots in jerseys. We use digitized players for this game. Taunt it. Tell them to back off, pay up, or front this, or shut up and let the ball do your dissing. Shove it. Hey, you do what it takes to win, and sometimes it takes a jab in the ribs and a push in the back. Pick it. 1 or 2 player action, 3 killer opponents, 8 different one-on-one games. Slam it! Slam Cam lets you show off your Dunkin' movies from the view of the brutalized basket.
Have you been injured?
Keep it! Password save your best games, just in case some fool doubts how good you really are. Face it, you're gonna get a little dirty, and this game's gonna get a lot dirty. Get it? Now, Jammit!
Longfellow himself couldn't have said it any better. Jammit, everybody. Well, after that cosmic blast of everything 90s, it's time for our last good game, and this is the best one of the video. But first, let's quickly mention Aero the Acrobat. Not many people like Aero. He's probably one of the more famous, or infamous, of the many Sonic rip-offs out there, and his first game, while not necessarily awful on the control front, does come with a really quite obnoxious presentation, with dreadful circus themes and some horrid music. Not good. What's not often mentioned though is that things did get better for Aero. Aero the Acrobat 2 from 1994 is a much less obnoxious and far better designed game, one that's actually worth looking into. But that's not the game I'm covering. At around the same time as Aero 2, Sunsoft released Zero the Kamikaze Squirrel, a spin-off of the series featuring a guy who largely acted as Aero's antagonist in the other two games. So yeah, he's the series version of Knuckles. And this game? Well, I'm gonna say it. It's one of the absolute best platformers that you'll find on the Mega Drive. I am completely serious. Zero the Kamikaze Squirrel is not only a fantastic platformer, it's also one that's pretty unique on the system, a game that goes far beyond the usual. A lot of this just been down to the sheer amount of highly useful and fun things you can do with the character. Zero has an absolute ton of move tech available to him. Naturally he can run, jump, kick and throw shurikens, but he can also do a double jump, he can do a dive attack, he can do this really nice dive in the air. Hell, he can even do a big dive bomb that actually allows him to turn around and fly right up big chasms, which is complex but really fun to do. A Sonic rip-off this is absolutely not. Zero is chock full of tricks and it's actually quite easy to learn them all. The levels are very much catered to using and screwing around with all of these various moves. They're all rather open, full of pickups and little secrets to find. And naturally there's plenty of creatures lurking around. Again, a lot of Zero's moves are offensive, so you've certainly got the tools to deal with them. And when it comes to the traps, the jumping sequences and so on, again it works out very nicely. Zero has so many moves and it's so much fun to screw around and see what sort of combination is going to be the best, or indeed just the most fun, to deal with them. On top of this, you've got some perfectly fine graphics, not amazing, but the sort of thing you'd perhaps expect from, say, a good quality Amiga 1200 title, a Brian the Lion only far better gameplay wise, and the sound isn't bad either, which is an area where Sunsoft can fall down at times in this generation. Overall, this is a bloody lovely game, and it's kind of nice to see from Sunsoft. Compared to the general high quality stuff that they produced back in the 8-bit days, your Blaster Masters and Journey to Siliuses and what have you, Sunsoft did fall down a bit somewhat in the 16-bit years, a lot of their games being produced by Western studios and often being highly disappointing. See the miserable likes of Blaster Master 2 for example, or Superman. This is another Western game, of course. Like the other Aero titles, it's made by the largely more reliable Iguana Entertainment. And damn it, it's such a good game, it almost cancels out the other not-so-good Sunsoft games. Of all the good games in this video, this is absolutely the one you should play right frickin' now. Honestly, it's one of the best platformers on the system, and that's a pretty damn high bar. And yeah, of course you could play this on the SNES as well, if you wish. Whichever way, just bloody play it. Naturally, now we've had the best game, we've got to have the worst. And hoo boy have I got a right humdinger for you. The subject of this turkey is a rather famous doctor by the name of Indiana Jones, someone who's had a bit of a mixed history when it comes to games. There's certainly good ones. You've got titles like the old Atari Temple of Doom arcade, which is a jolly fun romp. And yeah, there's the bad. For example, I could easily talk about the dreadful Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, a typically horrid tier text game released on the Mega Drive that brings back many memories of disappointment. But no, what I have here is much worse. Of all the bad licensed game platforms that there are on the Mega Drive, I have to say this is quite possibly the very bottom. If I were to redo my list of worst 20 Mega Drive games from years back, this wouldn't just be on there, I reckon this would be in the bottom 5, for sure. There is perhaps no worse example of licensed platformer misery than Instruments of Chaos starring young Indiana Jones, a 1994 game from Brian A. Rice Inc. So yes, this is the game of the old 90s TV show where the adolescent Indy goes on adventures around the world, usually rubbing shoulders with various historical figures of the 20th century. You won't get much of that here in the plot, but at first it doesn't look too bad. It's set during World War I, and you must stop German agents from acquiring various bits of technology that will help their war machine, choosing whichever stage you want to go to next. Seems fine, until you start actually playing. My God. Young Indy here is one of the most uncontrollable and useless characters ever seen in a game. His whip is this utterly hopeless physics nightmare that almost never seems to hit enemies or takes an eternity to do so, by which point usually the enemy's busy knocking 7 shades out of you. And you'll most certainly be knocked around. There's no recovery time at all when you're hit, and every single badnik appears to be faster and stronger than you, even the birds. There have been times playing this where the enemies have basically juggled me with virtually no hope of escape until I've lost a life. Now you thought that Pica-Pau looked bad in this regard? It's got nothing whatsoever on this game. You do also have a limited gun and grenades that can help a bit, but even then it's usually hard to get a shot of those off in time. In short, young Indiana Jones is such a pathetic weakling that even Jameson would be able to cart him off to the hospital. If it wasn't bad enough that the enemies are all superior to you in every regard, the levels are also horrific. There's the Egyptian stage, a barren desert where every so often a sandstorm blows you miles back, often all the way back to the beginning of the level. Good luck with that one. How about the England stage, where the collision detection and physics are so bad and the movement so unnatural that it's not uncommon for you to just fall through everything? Or the India stage, where you have to deal with what might be the absolute worst rope physics that have been seen in any game. I did actually manage to complete the Tibet levels. This one was just a basic sort of affair, mostly jumping right and then a couple of stages of jumping up. But still, it's hopelessly mundane, and even the simple act of jumping around is fraught with unnecessary danger. You may occasionally find some graphics here and there that don't look too bad, but this does less than nothing to make up for a game that feels completely broken in just about all of its fundamentals. And naturally, rubbish sound on a platter makes the torturous experience complete. In closing, yeah, this is one that speaks for itself. When you're being bounced around all over the shop, watching as enemies basically play piggy in the middle with you and the string of feculent licorice that's apparently supposed to be your whip, you know you are playing a true, red-flagged, AAA star colostomy bag filled with rancid excretia. Forget the Mega Drive, this is one of the most useless attempts at a video game that I have ever come across, in all of my years. Well, there's another selection of Mega Drive deep cuts for you. Will there be another? Well, I'm sure there will be. Even as I come close to the end of the big old Sega Mega Wheel, I'm still finding some rather curious games dotted around, ones that are worth adding to the lists and potentially writing about in some form, whether it be effusive praise or barbed invective. There's plenty more out there on this voyage of discovery, and I'm sure I'll still be thinking about some of these titles for a good while after the wheel's over. But hopefully you've enjoyed this little journey into the Mega Drive's nether regions, and until the next time, bye for now.